All right, hi everyone. Thanks for joining me. I'm Zach Wynn. I'm an editor with Campus Safety, and I'm joined today with Gary Sigrist. He's a school security consultant and expert. Gary, thanks for coming on.
Glad to be here today, Zach.
Yeah, yeah. Obviously, we're talking under unfortunate circumstances with the South Florida shooting having occurred yesterday. Obviously, our thoughts and prayers go out to the families, victims, and that entire community. But we thought it was a good opportunity to talk about threat assessments and the processes that K through 12 schools can go through to ensure that their campuses are safer. So I thought, what better way to do that than bring on an expert like Gary, who we've worked with in the past on webinars. He's attended and spoken at our conferences. He's really knowledgeable on the topic of threat assessment and threat management. So we can just get right into it. Gary, I thought it would be helpful at first to just describe to me how a high-functioning threat assessment program should be working in a school district.
Well, the first thing you have to have is you have to have a team in place. And with that team in place, there has to be a methodology for reporting all threats. Regardless of how minor the threat is, anytime there's a threat in the school, there should be a threat assessment. And that level of threat assessment depends on the type of threat. For example, if a teacher overhears another student talking about wanting to kill a teacher, and the teacher intervenes and says, "Can you tell me what's going on here?" And the student says, "Well, I'm mad at that teacher. I failed a test in his class." Okay, so you really don't want to kill him. No, I don't. So what's going to happen then is that student and that teacher are going to go down to the principal's office. They're going to have a conversation. There'll be a phone call to the parents. There'll be a little bit of an investigation as to, do you have weapons in your house? If you do, are they secured? We don't believe that your child was making a credible threat on this teacher, but in today's day and age, that's inappropriate. And so therefore, we'd like you to reaffirm that at home. And really, there shouldn't be, depending on the age of the child, there shouldn't be any other real actions other than there's been a notification. However, if, for example, a student is overheard saying, "I want to kill this teacher. I know this teacher eats lunch by himself every day at 11 o'clock. My grandfather has shotguns in the basement locked up in the gun cabinet. The keys are in the tackle box out in the garage." Now there's a plan in place. There are details. The child has access to weapons. That is more of a serious substantive threat, and now we're going to have to involve law enforcement as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an important distinction to make involving credibility of threats and all those other factors. If a school district has no threat assessment apparatus in place at the time, what are some first steps that they can take to start formulating one?
Well, they need to do some research, and they need to find someone who can do the training for them. It is important that they have everything from board policy to a standard set of procedures that will be followed every single time that there is a threat that is reported to the school or overheard at the school.
Mm-hmm. And who should be involved in that process?
Well, if we start with the building principal, who's generally the incident commander of the building and the person in charge of decisions, obviously they have to be on the team. It can be also staff members who have an interest. One of the things that we recommend is that your teachers, your building principal, all get the training. If you have an SRO, the SRO gets the training. But when you're assembling a team to evaluate what you consider to be a substantive or serious substantive threat, you also want to include on the team an advocate for the child. So, for example, if you are a student has made a threat, and in the course of your gathering information, you pull the child's transcripts, and you find out that they get C's and D's in all of their classes, but in one class, 2 semesters in a row, they got a B in a class. So you might want to go talk to that teacher because obviously that child did better in that class. There might be a relationship, and there can be some additional insight that can help in your threat assessment. I want people to understand that threat assessment is not an adversarial process. You are not using a threat assessment team in order to discipline, suspend, or expel a student. You are creating a threat assessment team to prevent the targeted act of violence, to protect those who could be victims. But third and most important, you want to help that child that's on a pathway to violence. It's not normal for a child to want to do what we saw yesterday in Florida. And so if we can engage the parents and work with the child, we can then get that child off the pathway and they'll no longer be a threat. If we just expel that child, that doesn't mean the threat goes away.
Mm-hmm. And you've mentioned training a few times. Can you talk more about what kind of training members of the threat assessment team should go under?
Well, they have to understand the basic premises of what a threat assessment is. They have to understand that they have to articulate a specific behavior. Those of us that have been around a long time, after Columbine, everyone wanted to know who the next shooter would be. And some people said, well, it's anybody that's wearing black. Well, that's not true. It's what are their outlying behaviors that cause you to have concerns. So we teach the people, here are the behaviors that you might be seeing. Articulate why it raises a level of concern for you. Was it a writing in a journal? Was it something they said in class? Was it something that was posted? And then once they have that information, okay, how do we organize it, manage it, and then follow the process of moving through the threat assessment so that we can help the child and prevent the targeted act of violence.
Mm-hmm. And what role should local law enforcement agencies play in the threat assessment process at schools, if any?
Well, my recommendation is when you're talking about middle school and high school, if a child makes a threat, I'm going to kill students at school, I'm going to blow up the building, I want to kill this teacher, that's a crime. In Ohio, it's called menacing or aggravated menacing. And you want to at least report that to your local law enforcement. Even if you do the threat assessment and you find out that it's a transient threat, that the child has no means or methods to do that, but by at least filing a report, that child may be having issues in the community that law enforcement knows about that you as a school don't. And then obviously, if we believe that this is a serious substantive threat, for example, in Uniontown, Pennsylvania a couple weeks ago, where somebody reported a student, the police got involved, they were actually able to stop the targeted act of violence. And then I read this week where they charged the mom because she provided weapons to the child.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it would be important to discuss student privacy concerns here as well. If you're sharing information with law enforcement or involving them in any way, what kind of considerations do you have to make to ensure students maintain privacy?
Well, one of the interesting things that came out after Virginia Tech was clarification from the United States Department of Education and FERPA. And they were pretty clear that in the name of safety, if we believe that there's a direct threat to somebody, then we can share that information. So if I heard that, tomorrow a student is going to shoot up the school, we're going to involve the police right away. If we found out that last summer that a child was said that they were going to do the same thing, then it's a little bit grayer area because it's over a year old. It's not relevant at that moment in time. So you have to just err on the side of safety. And so if you believe that a student is at risk, and when we talk about using a threat assessment, we're not just using a threat assessment for a targeted act of violence toward schools. You may be using a threat assessment because a child is at risk of harming themselves. So they may not be talking about killing their classmates. They may be talking about killing themselves. And so we have a duty as educators to prevent that from happening by using our threat assessment teams.
Yeah, and once a threat has been identified and it's ongoing, what next steps should schools take in terms of threat management?
Okay, if they believe that it's a valid threat, it's a substantive threat or a serious substantive threat, they're going to have to come up with a safety plan. What is it that the parents will do? What is it the child will do? What is it that the schools will do to make sure that the students and staff at that school are safe? And so, it might be the child has to go to counseling, and then the parents have to waive their HIPAA rights so that the school can talk to the counselor to make sure that this child no longer poses a threat. In most states, you can't suspend a child for more than 10 days. So if you had a child that made a serious substantive threat, you might suspend that child for 10 days to give yourself time to put together a safety plan to make sure that your students and staff are protected.
Yeah, do you have any other advice for managing a threat? I'm thinking of, if a student is off campus, maybe he's been expelled or she's been expelled. Do you have any other advice or, best practices for schools in that sense?
Unfortunately, today schools need to be monitoring social media. They also need to give students and parents a way to share information that causes concern. When I first started teaching a long time ago, students always said I would never tell on another student because snitches get stitches. Fortunately, in today's culture, kids understand that if a student might harm themselves or others at school, I have to tell. Is there a person in that building? Do you have an anonymous hotline? Do you have a tip line? How can people report their concerns to the school? And then once the school has that threat, then they can, if need be, contact law enforcement.
Okay. And you've worked with a lot of different school districts. Are there any common mistakes you see or room for improvement from districts who are creating and running these threat assessment programs?
One, these would be minor. One, they're not sharing with their staff, hey, we have this process in place. We take all threats seriously, and this is how you report a threat. The other is that sometimes they're pretty lax in their paperwork. Remember, there's going to be a lawsuit after any school shooting. And, if a school did what they were supposed to, if they had a threat assessment team and they documented everything and they worked with first responders, that's going to help the schools during that litigation. The nice thing about threat assessment teams is they are legally defensible in court. People realize that these are important, and it shows that the school is proactive in taking care of all threats that they receive.
Yeah, and do you think are there any other resources that you want to tell school officials about for getting started or improving their threat assessment teams?
I always recommend that they go back to the Secret Service Safe School Initiative that's available online for free. It was a report that came out after Columbine, and it pretty much details the procedures that schools need to go through and why they need to go through this. I think that if a school does not have a threat assessment team in place, a district doesn't, then they're kind of negligent, because threats happen every day, and we have to have a uniform way of dealing with every threat.
Yeah. And is there anything else that you want to add that I didn't ask about in terms of establishing and improving threat assessment teams?
I just want to reiterate a couple of things. I want people to understand that a threat assessment team is not adversarial. We don't do threat assessments to punish a child. There may be discipline because of their behaviors, but that's separate from a threat assessment. The three things that we're trying to do in a threat assessment is prevent the event from occurring, protect intended victims, and again, most importantly, get help for that person who is on a pathway to justification or a pathway to violence.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to end it. So, Gary, thanks again for giving me your time. I know you're a busy guy.
I'm glad to help out, Zach.
Great. And we hope this was educational for our audience. Hope you got some things away from this. And, if it goes towards anybody making their schools a little bit safer, then this was absolutely worth it. So keep up the hard work, everyone. And we'll see you again next time. Thanks.